summer of 2012, in a dusty military base on the outskirts of Kandahar, Afghanistan, Captain John Parker adjusted his helmet and stepped into the scorching sun. The temperature had soared past 110 degrees, and the air shimmered like a furnace. As an intelligence officer with the US Army, he had seen more than his fair share of war zones, but something about Afghanistan felt different. John was a career man, disciplined, loyal, and skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured or explained. Faith to him was an emotional crutch. He had grown up in a nominally Christian family in Oklahoma, but had long abandoned religion in favor of facts, strategy, and control. But all of that began to unravel during his third month in the region. His mission was clear: monitor a small, remote village believed to be harboring Taliban informants. From a vantage point in the mountains, his unit watched every movement: children playing with tin cans, women fetching water from wells, and men kneeling in unison 5 times a day, facing a direction unknown to him. What puzzled John most wasn't enemy activity. It was the villagers themselves. Despite poverty, despite drone strikes echoing in the distance, despite losing family members to conflict, the people he observed seemed at peace. They laughed, they shared what little they had, and every day, without fail, they stopped everything to pray. One evening, while reviewing surveillance footage alone, he heard it for the first time. A soft voice, worn and weathered but beautiful, drifting from the village mosque. Indeed, in the remembrance of God do hearts find rest. Quran 13:28. He froze. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling. Something inside him stirred, like an old door creaking open. He couldn't explain it. The next night, he stayed up late, listening to recordings of the Adhan, the Islamic call to prayer, on YouTube, using a secured satellite line. Each time he heard it, goosebumps ran down his arms. What was this religion? Why was it so powerful? His curiosity grew into obsession. He ordered a translated Quran under the guise of cultural research and began reading it during his night shifts. The words weren't what he expected. He had imagined fire and brimstone, but instead he found logic, compassion, discipline, and unity. The stories of prophets he had heard as a child, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, were all here, but with a sense of continuity and clarity he'd never seen before. And above all, one word kept echoing: submission. Submission not to a man, not to a government, but to the one Creator. Weeks passed. One night after a brutal 12-hour shift, John sat on the edge of his bunk, holding the Quran in his trembling hands. Tears welled up in his eyes. For a man trained to suppress emotion, it was foreign, frightening even. He whispered into the silence, "God, if you're real, show me. I want to believe." And then something broke. Not in the room, but inside him. Pride, ego, doubt, all of it crumbled. At 3:17 a.m. on August 12, 2012, in a darkened tent lit only by the glow of a laptop, Captain John Parker quietly uttered the Shahada, the Islamic testimony of faith. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadu Rasul Allah. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. He had become Muslim. But the journey didn't end there. It had only begun. John knew what this meant. In the military, especially in intelligence circles, converting to Islam raised red flags. He kept his faith a secret, praying silently in his tent, learning how to perform wudu with bottled water, memorizing small surahs from YouTube videos. When his deployment ended, he returned to the US, a changed man. He left the army a year later, not in disgrace, but with an honorable discharge. He changed his name legally to Yusuf Parker, found a small Muslim community in Colorado, and slowly began to rebuild his life around his new identity. But it wasn't easy. His family was shocked. His friends called him brainwashed. Some accused him of betraying his country. But Yusuf didn't waver. He had found peace. The kind of peace bullets couldn't disturb. The kind of peace politics couldn't define. In 2017, he stood in front of an audience at a university seminar on religious freedom. Dressed in a simple gray thobe, his American accent unmistakable, he said, "I didn't find Islam in a mosque. I found it in the silence of the mountains, in the voice of a wounded people who never stopped praying, in the pages of a book I was trained to fear. Islam didn't change who I am. It revealed who I was meant to be." Today, Yusuf runs a non-profit helping war veterans suffering from PTSD. He shares his story not to convert but to connect, because he believes that truth doesn't scream, it whispers to the heart that's ready. And in the middle of a war zone, far from home, his heart finally listened. One cold evening in Denver, Yusuf walked out of the masjid after Isha prayer. Snowflakes danced through the air as the streetlights bathed the world in a golden glow. He stood for a moment, gazing up at the sky, silent, endless, and vast. For years he had searched for control, for certainty, for mission. Now he simply searched for nearness to the one who had always been near. He often wondered why it had happened the way it did. Why him? Why in a war zone, on the other side of the world? Why through a faith he had been conditioned to fear? But maybe that was the point. Maybe faith wasn't meant to arrive when life is calm and easy, but when everything familiar is stripped away. When pride is silent, when fear is loud, when the soul, worn thin, whispers, "Help me." He no longer saw his past as a contradiction to his present. He was still a soldier, just no longer at war with himself. Years later, Yusuf would publish a memoir titled The Enemy Within, chronicling his personal battle between logic and faith, fear and surrender. The book quietly made waves, especially among veterans and seekers who felt disillusioned by modern life. Not because it preached, but because it was honest. When asked in an interview what message he would give to others seeking truth, he paused, smiled gently, and said, "Don't be afraid to unlearn. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And if you ever find yourself in the middle of nowhere, hearing a whisper you can't explain, don't ignore it. That's the invitation. That's the mercy." God doesn't need armies. He just needs hearts. And even the hardest ones can soften if they're brave enough to listen. And so, the man once known as Captain John Parker, who once believed in nothing but orders and strategy, now lives as Yusuf, husband, father, mentor, and believer, not because someone convinced him, but because, in the quiet shadows of war, he found something more powerful than bullets. He found God, and that changed everything.